Now back to Viewpoint with Gene Dean on Supertalk 94.1 FM and AM 930.
And my next guest is Frank Woodruff. Frank is the director of the National Alliance of Community Economic Development Associations, and we are going to talk about home ownership. As I was telling Frank before we came on the air, it seems to me that maybe things are looking up a little bit. Houses that have been vacant for 1, 2, or more years are now selling and being occupied. But nevertheless, there is still this horrible problem of foreclosure. And I want to find out from Frank, is that still going on, or just exactly what is happening, and what should be done to those who are guilty or have been guilty of promoting these problems? So, good morning, Frank. It's good to talk with you.
Good morning, Gene. Thanks for having me.
I'm delighted to do that, and I think maybe we should start out by finding whether or not this issue of foreclosures, obviously people are still suffering from the foreclosures that have already happened, but are there properties throughout the country that are still going into foreclosure, or is that pretty much over?
Oh, no, there absolutely are, Gene. And there are certain steps that communities and institutions and government can take to help prevent and help stem the rate of foreclosures, the high rate of foreclosures that are happening in West Virginia and other parts of the country. And there are really, as we look at it, there are four main steps, four major types of steps that can be taken to prevent foreclosures, at least at the national level and at the governmental level. The first one is economic. Very simply, the Federal Reserve will have to continue to keep interest rates low. As we were talking about just before we came on, houses and homes are not moving off the market, and a large reason for that is that money and capital is not moving. And the only way the quickest way we can get that capital moving is to keep interest rates low. So we will continue to see that for the foreseeable future. The second piece is there's a legal there's a legal piece to this, and we're beginning to see that. Back in February, the 49 attorneys general from around the country settled a lawsuit with 5 large financial institutions in America to settle some of their less desirable practices that they had that led to part of the foreclosure crisis and kept it going. We saw, I think, last week with Wells Fargo and SunTrust, they settled on a racial profiling type of settlement. We are hearing rumors that there will be another settlement with the 49 attorneys general, this time with smaller institutions. That remains to be seen. And I know, Gene, as a good journalist, you're not in the business of rumors, but certainly I'm not above it, and I hope to see that something does happen in that regard. And there will be more in lawsuits that we should keep an eye out for. There, no doubt, we're seeing a series of them. There will be continue to be some. They're brought on by public entities, cities, counties, states, and even the federal government, and we should support them in those lawsuits when appropriate. The third piece is a political piece, and the government will have to play a role in this crisis. There's no way around it. Anyone who says differently is trying to pull the wool over your eyes. Federal, state, local governments will have to be part of the solution. The most immediate way the federal government can try to stem foreclosures is to create and be real serious about a jobs program, because too many hardworking people who play by the rules can't find a job. And if they can't find a job, they can't stay out of foreclosure. They can't be productive members of society and of the economy. So that's one way. Government is only part of the answer, but it has to be part of it. It's a very integral part of it. And the jobs program is something very immediately that can contribute positively. And the last piece is the community piece, and that's where the Nacita Network is part of this. And there may be people listening to your show today who may be getting threatening phone calls or letters in the mail from your financial institution, or can see down the road that making your monthly payment might be difficult for one reason or another. And frankly, you may not feel like you can trust your lender or your financial institution, and in some ways, who can blame you? But there are in the Nacita Network, in our network, we know of a national network of neighborhood trusted organizations who are professional, they're knowledgeable, and they're there to connect you with resources that are available. They are available, and they're available for little or no cost. Try not to get stuck into scams. Anyone who wants to charge you charge you a large sum of money for these types of services. Be very wary of. But resources are available. So those 4 pieces will be absolutely critical to stemming the foreclosures.
Well, that's a very comprehensive outline. I appreciate that, Frank. And I'm wondering, your organization, is there like a website or telephone numbers that people should contact your organization or so that you can point them in the right direction?
I would. We have a network of state associations in 26 states, 33 associations in 26 states. If we have a member in your state, absolutely you can go to our site. But again, we're only in 26. We are not in West Virginia. What I would recommend is for people who are in West Virginia who may be looking for help is to go to huntingtonhousing.com. It is in the city of Huntington, anyways, your local housing authority. They have good resources. I was just at a Google search last night in preparation. Congresswoman Shelley Moore's website has some good information up there. But if you want a direct connection to local resources, your best bet will be to go to your local elected officials, honestly. And if you call one and they're not helpful, call a different one, because the one that can't help you isn't probably worth your vote. Because they absolutely can help. That's what they're there for, to connect you with governmental resources, but also other nonprofit resources. And this is a little funny story. We occasionally go to meetings on the Hill, on Capitol Hill, and visit with staffers of from the Housing Urban Development agency, but also with staffers of elected officials, and they have their own personal vested interest in making sure these resources are available, because if they aren't available, people begin calling their offices and they turn into de facto housing counselors, which is not their area of expertise. So there are resources available. In other words, contact. Your best bet is your local agency. Certainly our website is appropriate for some states.
And that website is?
www.naceda.org, NACEDA.
Okay. And although you mentioned specifically West Virginia, here in Huntington, of course, we're in the tri-state region of Kentucky and Ohio, so I suppose the same information would apply to those 2 states.
That's true. And specifically, we do have a very active member in Ohio, the Ohio CDC Association. That's Ohio Community Development Corporation Association, who can connect you if you're in Ohio.
Okay. Well, that's great to know. And I want to go back, Frank, to the situation with the settlements. You're in a position to know what the settlements were and whether or not you think that the lending institutions were punished sufficiently. That's part of my question. The second part is, have the settlements really helped those who were put into foreclosure? But let's start out with the bank situation, the financial and the lending institutions. Have they really paid the price for what they did?
Well, it's a pretty broad question. I will say that it's ongoing. Some institutions have stepped up to the table, others have not. But in terms of legal settlements, I mean, and the legal settlements are just the first step. Historically, the only way that large financial institutions have been held accountable by their actions is by communities being organized. And I don't mean to rehash the 2008 election, but really that is the way that it was done. And the most famous example is in the 1970s, when financial institutions would literally, in their board meetings, pull out a map of a neighborhood and say, draw a red box around a piece of the neighborhood and say, we are not going to lend here. And for any number of reasons, mostly they didn't think they could make money. Sometimes there were racial undertones to those decisions. Other times they thought they couldn't make money off of the elderly. They wouldn't lend to small businesses, invest in mortgages, and the response to, and the ironic part to that is that in some cases the red box they were drawing was around their own bank, and so communities got organized and said, we are not going to take this anymore. If you are going to accept deposits in our neighborhood, you are going to invest in our neighborhood, in our community. And from that came the Community Reinvestment Act. A more recent example is the Dodd-Frank Act, which created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. It's been a politically divisive piece of legislation. But it was and you'll hear the presidential campaigns talk about it for the next couple of months. But it was a direct response to community outrage. And if you think your financial institution or a mystery lender of some kind comes into your community and they're doing something that's not acceptable or maybe sketchy, if you go to consumerfinance.gov, you can submit complaints on their website. But government will have to play a role. They'll have to, communities will have to be organized and demand their elected officials to do something because they can. They have the power to, but only if they're told to by their constituents.
In the in the foreclosure crisis, Frank, we have heard mostly the big-named lending institutions, the big-name banks. But I believe, probably due to legislation some years ago, that there are far more community-owned banks now than there used to be. Is that just a thought on my part, or is that correct, that there are more smaller banks, smaller community-oriented banks?
I couldn't say for sure. I actually my weak knowledge on it and the trajectory I've seen is actually the opposite. There tends to be more. There tends to be a large financial institutions who are becoming bigger, and sometimes the Bank of America, the cities, those are the really big ones, and they can't really get any bigger. But the medium-sized ones are growing into parts of the country, the South, for example, the Southeast. And they tend to be bigger. I have not witnessed a trend in a growth of community-owned banks, though I think one type of growth that has slowed, though it has trended over the last decade or so, is a growth in mortgage lenders that don't necessarily have a building where they take deposits, but set up offices where people can simply get mortgages. And there may be a slight growth in that. And not to say that you're wrong, Gene. I just haven't seen it.
Well, I'm not saying I'm right. I just just wondered about that. But, Frank, I have a lot more questions for you here. But if you'll stay with me for a couple of minutes, I need to slip some commercials in here. Is that okay with you?
Let's pay the bills.
Okay. My guest is Frank Woodruff, and Frank is the director of the National Alliance of Community Economic Development Associations. We're talking about the housing situation, loans, banks making settlements with those who have gone into foreclosure. And we will take a short break here. This is Viewpoint with Gene Dean on Supertalk 94.1 FM and AM 930. Please stay with me. I'll be right back.
Now back to Viewpoint with Gene Dean on Supertalk 94.1 FM and AM 930.
And my guest is Frank Woodruff, and we are talking about the home ownership situation, particularly thinking about foreclosures. And Frank, I have some concerns because I think we tend to believe that maybe this foreclosure situation is over, but I have read that there are more foreclosures expected to occur in this year, in 2012. Do you agree with that?
There will absolutely be more homes foreclosed on this year, absolutely.
Is there anything that can can stem this tide of foreclosures, or is it going to be going on and on and on?
Well, I think the only that's a tough question, Dean. If I had the answer, I would have a much higher paid job than I do today. But I think it's important for us all to realize that this is all connected, right? That the housing and home ownership crisis that we've faced the last few years directly has led to job loss, and there's a real economic effect. But it's important to remember that the only way we're going to be able to stop it is some of the points I outlined earlier. But there are real economic effects. It's in our collective fiscal interest to find a way to keep people in their homes. Foreclosure doesn't help anyone. If people don't have a place to live, it's harder for them to keep a job and find a job. It's harder for them to be productive members of the economy. Their children tend to do less well in school, and it leads to a real human. It's a real human effect. That if people are able to stay in their homes, they use fewer social services, fewer law enforcement resources, and even if you're not going through foreclosure, you have to realize that this affects you as well. We are all connected to each other's fate. a good example, Gene, you mentioned it before we came on the air about your neighbor who had a vacant home for 2 years. Last year I went to Youngstown, Ohio. Maybe you have some listeners in Youngstown. Visited a very good grassroots organization there that's doing tremendous work in Youngstown. Youngstown is the poster child for America's shrinking city, and they accept that. I was talking to their staff. I was talking to a young man there, their deputy director, I believe it was, and he mentioned a statistic that 46% of the units, living units in the city of Youngstown, were vacant. And I thought, wow, 46 units, that's a lot. But then we got in the car and we drove down the street, and it's one thing to hear the number 46%. It's another to drive down the street, and literally, Gene, every other house is boarded up and abandoned, and has been in some cases for the better part of a decade. And so even if you weren't someone who vacated that house, but let's say you live next door, as in your case with your neighbor, Gene, that has an effect on your property value. Abandoned homes breed crime. There's real community health concerns with pests, rats, and other concerns. So it's important that we all realize we're in this together. And the only way we're going to ensure a long-lasting economy, and this may be an answer that's pretty far removed, but I think it's important to remember, is to believe what Nasita believes and what our network believes, is that our economic strength and our quality of life is a direct result of the strength in each and every community in America. Healthy communities have a strong small business sector, provide jobs, residents have a stable place to call home. There's access to education, and there's a government that is truly working for the people. Because again, government has to be part of the answer, and all of those are examples of how communities can achieve strength. And I mean, quote Senator Paul Wellstone, we all do better when we all do better.
Well, that's for sure. Frank, I have a caller on the line. Is it okay with you if we go ahead and take that call?
Let's have one.
Good. Well, good morning, Pete.
Good morning.
And do you have a question, or you obviously like to join in this conversation? Great.
Well, I wonder what his point of view would be on it wouldn't affect this part of the country as much as it would the rest of it, but if the banks were simply forced to reset the mortgages to what the housing values decreased to, would help this mortgage default situation. Plus, it would actually help the banks because when they repossess these places, they don't get anywhere near the value of what the stated values are.
Right. What do you think, Frank?
That's absolutely true, Pete. And I wanted to allude to this earlier. I'm glad you brought it up. Is that it's in all of our collective interest to not have homes foreclosed on. There's a human effect, but there's also a real economic and monetary effect. The banks are not in the business of selling homes. They sell mortgages, and there's a big difference. They don't want this property on their books, and if it's on their books, then they're responsible for selling a home and not a mortgage, and that's not really what they do. Pete, I believe, alluded to a little bit of an aspect of the big national mortgage settlement between the 49 attorneys general and the 5 large financial institutions. A piece of that is that the banks are going to be required to do principal reductions, and what that means is that people who are underwater on their mortgages but are playing by the rules will be able to work with a bank to write down a portion of their principal, and the banks are required to do that as part of the settlement, and those resources are available. Now, if you are in that situation, you've been getting maybe threatening phone calls from your institution or demanding letters, and frankly, now the banks are turning around and trying to offer you these services. And, Frank, I don't blame you for not wanting to answer the phone or trust what they're saying. So I would really encourage you, first of all, to realize that there are resources available for this type of thing if your home is underwater. In that case, I mean, you're paying more on your mortgage than your home is worth. And to go to a trusted source, a community organization, or even your local government, and they should be able to connect you with those resources.
Well, it certainly sounds like you raised a very good question there, Pete, and I think that Frank is making some excellent suggestions here, and I'm glad to know that bringing down the principal on the part by the banks is part of most of these settlements, Frank.
That's a good. It's part of the big settlement.
Okay.
And it's part of some of them, but not all of them. I couldn't speak to which. Certainly the big settlement, though.
Okay.
Well, the point of disclosure, I've never had a mortgage and don't own any debt on anything. But I think as a national policy, they need to address the reset to the actual values of what the houses are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it certainly, I guess that would take congressional action. I doubt that the banks are going to do that on their own. Do you think?
The banks will do whatever turns them profit. I mean, that's what they do. You know, I mean, it's a market, and I think what Pete is alluding to is that there is the homes of prices prior to the bubble being burst were inflated. I mean, that's where the term bubble comes from.
Sure.
There was this artificial roof on prices that just kept getting bigger and bigger, and it was really easy for it to get bigger. And then the bubble burst, and then we see what's really on the pussy underside of the bubble. Sorry for the vivid language, but that's really what we saw.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I think Pete's right. We will start to see a correction in the price of houses, but again, it'll take a long time. And brings me to another point, Gene, that I wanted to make is that as housing prices begin to correct themselves, folks who thought we put it bluntly, the American dream is evolving. We found out that homeownership is not necessarily for everyone. As Pete said, he's never had a mortgage. And you know what? Just because Pete doesn't have a mortgage doesn't mean he can't live the American dream. It doesn't mean he can't raise a family. If he wants to rent, that's fine. There's lots of advantages to renting. You don't have the overhead cost of maintenance. You can be more mobile to take a higher paying job. And that's okay. And I think that part of the American dream is it's not completely going away, but it is evolving.
Well, that's true. And I'm so sorry, Pete. I'm going to have to cut you off here because I'm almost out of time. But thank you so much for calling in. And also, Frank, thank you for joining me this morning, too. I've learned a lot from you, and I know that our listeners have also. So thank you again for joining me.
Thanks, Gene.
Bye-bye. Frank Woodruff of the National Council of Economic Development Corporations.